Welcome, scholars, to this research study that I'm calling A New World. I want to start with the illustration from the last video, which was about perception. If you recall, I began with the most limited perception, where you could only see this object, which is the same object in all three instances, but the very first one was a very limited perception. You could only see it from the side, and it looked just like a bold black line. Then I broadened your perception and allowed you to look at it from a different angle, and you saw that it was, in fact, a much larger shape, a large rectangle. And then I turned on the lights, and of course you saw that it was actually a painting. It was the same object all three times, just seen from different perspectives. And we talked about the way our perspectives limit what our realities actually are. And that was part of what Plato talked about in his myth of the cave. I want to talk today about something Plato said, that the eyes may be unsighted in two ways. Plato warns Glaucon in the myth of the cave that the poor prisoner emerging from the cave into the world above is blinded by its brilliance. It takes time for the eyes to adjust from darkness to light. But he also warns us that the enlightened scholar returning to the cave below is blinded by its dimness. It takes just as long for your eyes to adjust from dark to light as from light to dark. In this scenario, each individual is equally blind when confronted with the world of the other. When the ignorant individual is confronted with the enlightenment of the scholar, it can seem very confusing. Similarly, when the scholar returns to the world of the ignorant person, it can be difficult for them to communicate because both are equally. Plato also warns us that we do not always immediately know which is which. That is, we do not always know whether someone else is adjusting to the brightness of our reality or to the dimness of our reality. So when he sees a mind confused and unable to see clearly, he will not laugh without thinking, but will ask himself whether it has come from a clearer world and is confused by the unaccustomed darkness, or whether it is dazzled by the stronger light of the clearer world to which it has escaped from its previous ignorance. So you may be wondering, what does this have to do with our thematic focus of the year on the American identity, its origins, its ideals, its contradictions? Well, this is all about the New World, and the focus of this particular research study has to do with the concept of colonial exceptionalism. As we all know, the New World was not in fact new. People lived in the Western Hemisphere for thousands of years before Europeans arrived. America was already settled before the settlers got there. While technologically less advanced, the natives of America at the time were still socially sophisticated. We often forget that. Their political structures were in many ways just as civilized as the absolute monarchies of France and England and Spain and Portugal. The economic structures of the native peoples were in a lot of ways more enlightened even. There was very little economic disparity among members of a Native Americans tribe. Of course, if the whole tribe, if one person starved in a tribe, the whole person starved. But also, if one person ate in the tribe, all of them ate, which you can't really say the same for countries like France and England, that sort of thing. Despite this, though, America was still viewed as this wild, untouched frontier. The vast majority of Europeans viewed Native Americans as primitive and thus inherently inferior. Sure, some Europeans seemed fascinated by these strange new cultures and beliefs, and some Europeans almost seemed appreciative of them in their writings, but any praise that we see coming from this time period from Europeans of Native Americans was always of the, quote, noble savage, not of the, quote, noble person. And so the white settlers' mission became to civilize the savages, to save them from themselves. Even today, this early view of Native Americans sort of colors our perceptions of what America was like in the early colonial and pre-Columbian times. We think of it as having this primitive people that was eventually colonized by a more developed people. We think of America itself as this land that was destined for greatness if only this great people would come along and utilize it. Our popular media has even reinforced these beliefs, sometimes subtly, sometimes not so subtly, as you're going to read about in this research study. In the end, they did, meaning the European settlers, they did then, and we are even now forgetting Plato's advice in Myth of the Cave, that the eyes may be unsighted in two ways, that we must not assume the confusion in others is their ignorance. It may very well turn out to be our own. Were those early European settlers really more advanced than the people who were already here? This is sort of the question I want you to ask yourself as you read through the text I've selected, as it kind of explores the identity of pre-Columbian and colonial America. Some of the key vocabulary that you need for this research study. We'll start with trivial, the adjective, meaning of very little importance or value, insignificant, as in don't bother me with trivial matters. Some related words, trivia or trivialities, that's the nominative form, the noun form of trivial, or to trivialize, the verb, that's to make something trivial. Beset, to attack on all sides, to assail, to harass, to be beset by enemies, beset by difficulties. The noun form of that, the state of being beset upon, is besetment. Barbarous, the adjective, uncivilized, wild, savage, crude, as in the barbarous natives wore deer skins and flung rocks. Giving you a noun form, the state of being barbarous is barbarousness, or the qualities, I guess, of being barbarous. Despot, any sort of tyrant or oppressor, anyone who rules absolutely. The despot ruled with an iron fist. The adjective would be despotic, describing characteristics of a despot. Next, endeavor, the verb, to exert oneself to do or affect something, to make an effort, to strive, as in we must constantly endeavor if we are to succeed. And then the other form of that is just the noun, the kind of thing, the endeavor. It's spelled the same way. Next up, colonialism. The control or governing influence of a nation over a dependent country, territory, or people, as in European colonialism in Africa. And then the adjective would be colonialist. Colonialist thought, colonialist ideas, colonialist doctrines, that sort of thing. Lastly, we come to Eurocentrism. Eurocentrism is the belief in the preeminence of Europe and Europeans as sort of focal to world culture, history, politics, economics, etc. It's that belief in European exceptionalism, that everything good came out of Europe, basically. As in this sentence, early settlers of America held a worldview that was colored by Eurocentric, or they held a Eurocentric worldview. And then the adjective form there, Eurocentric, the noun is Eurocentrism. All right, here's your reading list. I've got 9 selections for you this week. I'm going to start with excerpts from the Iroquois Constitution, a very fascinating document that was composed way back in the 12th century, long before our own American Constitution. Then we have the relation of Cabeza de Vaca, a narrative, a biographical account of Cabeza de Vaca's journeys in America. Next, we have a narrative of captivity and restoration by Mary Rowlandson, followed by a modern piece, followed by Christopher Columbus's journals, excerpts from his journal of the first voyage to America. Then we have the Requirimiento by King Ferdinand of Spain. Now we get into a modern piece, an excerpt from Columbus, The Four Voyages by Lawrence Bergreen. Then another modern piece, excerpts from Living with Europeans by Daniel Richter. Next, a letter from Captain John Smith, one of the most famous figures in early American history, his letter to Queen Anne of Great Britain. And then finally, Redesigning Pocahontas by Gary Edgerton and Kathy Murlock Jackson, about how modern popular media has sort of rebranded Pocahontas, if you will. All right, with that, go ahead and begin your research study.